This morning we've got Debra Gambrell, who is going to speak about warmth. And she is a pediatric anesthesiologist. She's also an integrative medical doctor, an osteopath, and sort of has this amazing story about warmth. And growing up in Europe, when I was sick as a kid, my mother always made us ride out the fever. And it wasn't until I got to the US, especially having kids, that it was, you've got to give them Tylenol, you've got to give them Tylenol. And it just went against everything that, every bone in my body that I'd been raised with, which was, no, you've got to have the fever to get rid of the bugs or get rid of whatever you've got. And so I wanted Debra to speak at this expo because I really feel that message is lost, especially here in the States. And so I'm really excited to have her speak here and tell us more about why warmth is really important. And she's an anesthesiologist that works with children, which we hope, you know, our children will never be in that situation to need that. But in that situation, she's seen where warmth, not only fever warmth, but the warmth of love and other things comes into it and plays an important role. And so I'm excited to have her here today. So Debra, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, a warm welcome this morning. Thank you guys for getting up and being here. And like she said, I'm a anesthesiologist, a pediatric anesthesiologist and integrative medicine. I'm a MAPS provider. I do biodynamic craniosacral therapy, and I also do anthroposophic medicine. So there are all of these hats that I kind of wear in my practice, my two different practices. This lecture is about warmth, and this lecture is for you guys. This is for you. So if you have any questions, please, at any time, go ahead and speak up. I think they want you to go to the mic so that it's recorded for the audio. But I really encourage questions because, again, this is for you. And if you have a question, probably somebody else does as well. I do move pretty fast, but don't let that intimidate you. Just speak up if you have something. Okay, so let's get started. So this is my son, Lucas. This was, he's now 10. At this stage in his life, he was having daily, near constant tantrums. He had chronic, massive diarrhea. He had hand flapping. He had all the signs of autism. Could not get him diagnosed at that time where I was. I was told by the doctor that he is normal. You can see right here, this is pretty much a sign that we're seeing in a lot of kids these days, you know, a sign of failure to detox. He's recovered now, which is great, and very, very lucky. He didn't have a severe form. So we know today that 1 out of 2 children has 1 out of 20 chronic medical diseases. This is in the literature, and this is what I see in my practice treating sensory and autism. We know in the grocery store we see it. These children are not in their bodies. They can't stand still. They don't know where they're at in space. You know, they're kind of always in this fight or flight. So in West Sonoma County, which is just an hour and a half north of here, we have all of these beautiful Gravenstein apple trees. And they were planted in the early 1800s by Russian trappers because they produce fruit in early July, which was really beneficial compared to other apple trees. Most of them have been cleared to make way for vineyards because it's more profitable. But the ones that do remain, they're trying to push as much fruit as they can. So what you can see is all of these boards are supporting these trees so that they can produce more fruit. And as I drive by those trees in the morning, I wonder, you know, what is the strength of the root of that tree? And what's the quality of the apple that's produced? And then I think, you know, when I walk into my clinic, I see all these children coming to me, these new patients, and they're propped up by their own boards, right? Western medicine and alternative medicine. These children are on vitamin D because mom doesn't make enough vitamin D in her milk. They're on iron supplements for anemia. They're on gut healing supplements. They're on super restrictive diets. They have headphones in the classroom, 3-legged stools. These children are propped up by all of these boards. And what is it doing to their will forces? How are they growing? And what kind of fruit are they going to produce? So, you know, that's one part of it. And the other part of the way doctors treat patients is by, in both Western and alternative medicine, is they're doing a lot of this anti-physiology. They're doing everything they can do to fight all the living processes in the body, and we're going to talk about how those actually are cooling our body over several generations. So for the last about 100 years, there's a big shift in the paradigm. So then where do we start? How do we get trees? This is another orchard, a rare orchard where there's no boards, but yet lots of fruit. You know, how do we go from the fully supported, boarded up child? How do we remove those boards? What's that process? So, you know, like we talked about, 100 years ago, there was a paradigm switch to a reductionist medicine model. So the scientists decided that they would take one piece of the human body, you know, try to fix it, and then consider that fix a success, that was healing. So we realized that the human body is not a machine, and that suppressing all of these processes that happen in the body only brings up a problem in another part of the body. And we've seen that, for instance, with chickenpox, if a child doesn't have chickenpox, as an adult they have a 21% increase in brain cancer. We see the same things with mumps and ovarian cancer. So there's something about this reductionistic way of medicine that's just not working. So we have this 100 years of suppressing the normal functions in the human body. We've been fighting the body with, you know, things like antibiotics, antipyretics, which is Tylenol and Motrin, antacids, antihypertensives, beta blockers, alpha blockers, dopamine blockers. We have a drug to block every receptor in the body. We've been essentially blocking our own humanity. And why have we been doing this? Because we've all been afraid. All of us, collectively, have been afraid of letting the body trying to heal itself. We've lost the trust and the wisdom of our body to bring us back in balance when we're sick. And, you know, Dr. Exley pointed to this last night, the idea of bringing something out of balance. It's really impossible to hold something out of balance. The body will try to get back. And I can tell you in the operating room, we do things, you know, to push that. We push that limit. You know, we give things like, we give things to alter the pH, we give things to alter the biome, we give things to alter the carbon dioxide in the blood, but the child will always try to go back to that homeostatic set point. There is a natural push to get back to neutral. And if you push a child out of that balance and send them to the recovery room, bad things happen. And any anesthesiologist can tell you that. So fear has been driving our medical paradigm for the past century. It's fear, essentially, that has led to the increase in these childhood diseases, you know, again, by blocking our humanity. So one of the things we can do is we can look at our own contribution of our individual contribution to the collective fear, and that's one part of it. You know, we can become curious as to, you know, why we have this fear, and we can become curious as to another option. I think that's the first point. That's how you transfer your emotion from fear to not fear, is to become curious. So aside from that piece, we're going to take a step into talking about consciousness as it applies to child development. So I saw this last week, and I thought it was interesting, and I wondered if the bar was too high or too low. So when I talk about consciousness entering the body, I sometimes get a sideways glance from people. They kind of wonder what I'm talking about. Is this New Age mysticism? Is this something, really far out there? But, as an anesthesiologist, consciousness is my medium. And in medical school, we learn about how to assess consciousness. And it's not just the mind, like science tells us. Science tells us consciousness is something that lives in our brain, right? But we know something that every doctor learns, that actually a large part of consciousness involves the body. So what we actually express through movement of our body tells us about a level of consciousness. So how do we bring consciousness into the body? How do we wake the child up? Okay? So there's a couple different ways that I use in my practice and a couple different ways that are really helpful. One of them is the creation of an image for the child to live into, combined with movement. Another thing is with warmth that we're going to talk about, and another way is with fevers. So when we create an image for the child to live into, we are actually activating the will force of the child to do something. They create a movement that actually brings consciousness and awareness into the body. And I'm going to get more into this. So think about when you're learning a new skill, like the fidget spinner. You know, all these kids I had to learn, right? It's really clumsy with those first few attempts, but you know, after a couple of minutes, you learn how to do it, and then all of a sudden you know how to do it. Next time you pick it up, it's in your cellular memory. You know how to do it. There's consciousness about how to do this that has come into your body. And that's with every skill that we have. So one of the things about anthroposophic medicine, and this is also true in Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine, there's different stages of child development that every child goes through. So the first stage we're looking at is from birth to age 7. It's development of the physical body, right? Children, babies are physical. They put everything in their mouth. They are touching everything. They're exploring it. They're manipulating it. This is the first 7 years. In the second 7 years, from age 7 to 14, we're looking at the development of feeling. The child's trying to figure out, what does it mean to hurt somebody else or to have an affection for somebody else? They're learning that. They're growing that consciousness. And then in the third 7 years, from age 14 to 21, there's a consciousness that comes into their thinking. So they're able to think about thinking. They're able to have advanced thinking concepts like abstract thinking and these things that are really advanced. But these things all come in stages, in these 7-year stages about. So in more and more elementary schools, they're using movement in this early childhood phase as a way to get children to do better on tests, okay? And one example that I've worked with personally, there's a special needs school in Santa Rosa, and what they do is they have the children line up in the morning to go for a morning walk. And what they do is the children line up, and the teacher stands behind the students, and they start to go. And if Johnny gets out of line, literally or figuratively, the teacher says, "Johnny, where should you be?" And Johnny says, he looks around, and he figures out where he's supposed to be. If they're at the lunch table, there's tables of 4, the teacher will look over at the lunch table and say, "I see 3 out of 4 children ready to eat lunch." All 4 children create an image in their mind, "Am I ready?" And almost all the time, that 4th kid will step up and do what he needs to do to be ready. And now this school is not like mildly autistic. Some of these children are nonverbal, chronic seizures, really sick children, and they can still live into these images. You know, the alternative would be, "Johnny, get back in line." Or, "Johnny, put your hands on your lap so we can eat." But what are those things? Those are boards. So I've seen some really, really great work with that as far as bringing consciousness into the body. Okay, so this is a really cute image of a child, about 5 years old, and he's reading a chapter book. You know, this is the epitome of mom did it right, right? If you have a 5-year-old reading, then obviously they're going to be successful, right? That's the cultural idea. That's the idea behind flashcards and early childhood education and just pushing reading at an early age. So what does this have to do with movement and consciousness coming into the body? When children are able to, through this first 7 years, develop a sense of 3D awareness of their body in space, they are able to develop a part of their brain, their right prefrontal lobe, which is where images are created, okay? So before they have the proprioceptive ability to know where they're at, if they start reading, they'll become sight readers. And this is how this happens. The word fox, F-O-X, in a child that doesn't have three-dimensional awareness enters right into the right prefrontal lobe as the letters F-O-X, okay? Because it's an immature brain. They can't form the image yet. Versus the child that's fully into their body three-dimensionally, when they read the word fox, it can then enter their left prefrontal lobe and an image of the animal pops up in their right prefrontal lobe because there's space. There's three-dimensional space for image creation. So you can imagine the amount of reading comprehension difficulties if you have a 5-year-old that is, solely focused on reading when they're not in their body yet. In fact, one of the things the Waldorf teachers do when they're assessing children for readiness, for first grade readiness for reading, is they have them first move their body, get into their body, jump roping, and there's a certain sequence they do. Then they have them draw on a piece of paper a person, a house, and a tree. The person part of it is actually their physical experience of their body. And if you see a child that has, a round head, 2 dots and a smile, no ears, and maybe they've got arms, they're just sticks, but there's no fingers, and there's legs but no feet, they're not in their body. They're not all the way. They don't have awareness of the ends of their body. The myelin hasn't propagated all the way through. So then that's when we would recommend certain movement therapy so the kids can really get into their body. But it's just a really interesting way to look at the child a little more closely. Yep, so that's crossing the midline. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. Thank you. So the question was, there's something about a child being able to take their hand from one side and bring it all the way over to the other side. And it's awareness of this side of the body connected to the other side. It has to do with crossing the cerebral midlines. Great question. Okay, so we were talking about this century-long idea of Western and alternative medicine using suppressive anti-physiology medicines, okay? This here is just a very plain diagram of a life process. This is true in cell biology. This is true in growing a business. This is true in growing relationships. Anything that's alive and growing has these 7 processes, okay? And when we think about all these medicines that are offered to our children, for instance, antibiotics. Antibiotics are going to inhibit this, 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 this. You can just see. You can take any substance. Antacids are going to inhibit your ability to respond to your environment. Vaccines might inhibit your ability to reproduce. So all of these things that were offered in Western medicine, and even things like colloidal silver, these alternative therapies that are killing therapies, they're killing life. So when we keep this model alive in our consciousness, it can guide us into the proper ways of supporting the life in our body. Of course there are situations where we're going to need antibiotics. Sometimes the life has grown out of control, but because of our fear, we think that that is always a problem. And maybe it's only a problem in 5 to 10% of extreme cases. So it's just kind of something to think about. Okay, so we talked about the changes in medicine over the past century, and let's dig a little bit deeper. When did we lose our heat? So because we have to start somewhere, I just picked 1923. Sears Roebuck had, for the first time in their catalog, a razor. And the reason they had the razor is because they were selling sleeveless dresses to women. Okay, so this is just a first example of how we're losing our heat, the hair and the sleeveless dress. From there, we saw things, we saw the use of synthetic fabrics and clothing. We had individual homes had the capacity to store food, store cold food with their ice boxes. We saw the invention of penicillin in the 1940s. Mothers were told to let their babies cry it out so as not to spoil them. McNeil created Tylenol in 1959 as a solution to the problems they had with aspirin. Synthetic diapers saved mom from having to wash their cloth diapers. Bedding was made of synthetic material, so even at night there was dysregulation of warmth because the child would sweat and then get too cold. More antibiotics were developed as a cure for everything to make the mom feel like she was doing something to help her child. Air conditioning was becoming a regular household commodity. Mothers could now proudly enter the workforce because they were told they could do it all. And thanks to President Reagan in 1986, we had an expanded vaccine schedule due to the loss of liability on behalf of the manufacturers and physicians. Video games replaced outdoor play. Ritalin was pushed by the school teacher, and the vaccine schedule again exploded and the mandates came. So one of the questions I'm asked a lot is, what do you mean by warmth? Do you mean physical warmth or emotional warmth or biochemical warmth? Like, what are you talking about? And I like this study. What they did was they took a study participant along with the guide into the elevator to go up to the study room. And as they get in the elevator, the study guide gives the participant their cup of hot coffee to hold. Hey, will you hold this while he ties his shoe? Then they get up to whatever floor they're on, and they exit and go do their study. And at the end, the person is offered a gift certificate. And they're also offered the option to give the gift certificate away to a friend. And they found that the people that held the warm beverage versus the cold beverage were more likely to give away their gift certificate. So what they say is warmth is the most powerful personality trait in social judgment, and attachment theorists have stressed the importance of this warmth for development from infant into adulthood. The insula is where they found there's an interaction of both processing physical temperature and interpersonal warmth information. And their hypothesis was that experiences of physical warmth would increase feelings of interpersonal warmth with the person's awareness of this influence. I thought that was really amazing. So we're going to go on to talk about warmth as consciousness. And I'm just going to say really briefly, if any of you, the next time you get sick and you get a fever, go inward with this experience. Feel what's happening in your body. Because I've had a lot of people be able to listen and feel disease in their body long before it manifests physically during a fever. Because when you have a fever coming into your body, you actually have increased consciousness, awareness of your body. So listen, go inward when you're sick. Okay? Okay. So I'm an anesthesiologist also, and one of the things we know is that if a patient's not warm enough, they won't wake up from their anesthesia. We know this is due from the mitochondrial temperature-dependent effect, and our enzymes are temperature-dependent. So this is a real thing. If you're not warm enough, consciousness can't come in. If there's a condition where the body is not able to be taken a hold of by the consciousness that's coming in, we see things like emergence delirium. The child they're in a state of confusion, they have unconscious movement, they have incoherent speech. If the physical body is too dense, and we know right now from that environmental working group study in 2005 that children are born with over 200 chemicals in their umbilical cord. That creates a denseness in the body. If children are too dense, it's harder for consciousness to come into the body. And if the physical body is too dense, so if it's full of residual undigested toxins, so viruses, metals, pesticides, emotions, EMF, the consciousness has a more difficult time actually coming into the body and penetrating. So this is also seen with a certain constitutional weakness in children with anesthesia. So we can consider the child with a history of asthma. And asthma we can look at as kind of a misplaced detox gesture, right? We're supposed to be pushing things out from our liver and our kidneys. And if those processes are not working for whatever reason, we see things like asthma. The toxins are trying to exit through another organ. Sometimes we see a rash in the skin. Sometimes we see a seizure. These are all displaced toxic. Glucose is one of the things that is a carrier of consciousness. It's so interesting that you talk about that. In anthroposophic medicine, we talk about it has a certain effect on the immune system when it's produced from the body, and the immune system being that higher level consciousness. Yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't used it. I work with kids, so we tend not to give things just to try it. You know, it's just, it's a different way of being.
Yeah.
But
I thought it was pretty safe, too.
yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So when I work with children, my goal of waking them up from anesthesia is to bring consciousness into the body in a coordinated fashion. So I want consciousness to come in at the same time with the same velocity. If, for instance, we have a child that's waking up on the operating room table and the electrical pad is ripped from their belly and they take a deep breath, consciousness enters their lungs before it enters the rest of their body, and we can see bronchospasm. So really, you know, when we talk about consciousness, it's all different. There's many different pathways in our body. And then looking at the way anesthesia, when we go to sleep and wake up, you know, we can see how when it's discoordinated, we can have problems. Okay, so here is an example of a body that's too physically dense and consciousness can't permeate. You know, we were talking about emergence delirium, so when you wake up from anesthesia and you have this confusion, the consciousness can't come into the body. And, you know, oxidative stress, which we know is there's a problem with liver methylation generally is a cause of this, leading to oxidative stress, stress on the brain, a physical densifying of the body, and the consciousness can't come in. It looks like extended confusion. So that's just one example. I was proud that anesthesia was the first one outside of limited bypass, limited cardiology, to come up with as a whole profession, the oxidative stress, because it's seen as woo-woo, which is crazy. Okay. So in 1924, almost 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner, who was the person who brought anthroposophic medicine to us out of anthroposophy, which is the study of how to know your world, he brought anthroposophic medicine. He had this quote. This was a year before he died. And he said, if the individuality of the child is weak, it, meaning the individuality, will be overcome by the inherited characteristics. So what is he talking about here? What is the individuality? What does he mean by heredity? Even in standard medicine, as we know it today, we know that children are born with kind of a generic immune system. There's this temporary sprinkling of the antibodies that come from mom, but they're still kind of generic. They need to learn what is out in their environment to become an individual. So all of their experiences they have create kind of their own personal education of their immune system. If we don't have those opportunities, if we don't have our childhood illnesses and these opportunities to individualize, then heredity can take over. Okay? And we know this. We have less childhood illnesses, we have more cancer. So that's just one example. This was over 100 years ago. Okay, so what is heat? Heat is all of these things. Diverse biome, healthy liver, detox pathways, clean mitochondria, emotional warmth. But the biggest thing about heat is our ability to digest something down to its 0 point. It's the ability to take something into our body, whether it's through our mouth, through our eyes, through our ears, through our skin, through our emotions, take all of this in to our body, fully digest it down to a 0 point, and then make that sensation our own. If we can't do that, if we can't bring something down to 0, and there's residual undigested toxins, the body has to spend its own warmth energy to digest that. Dr. Exley talked about that last night with aluminum. When aluminum is in the body's always trying to do something with it to negate the effects of the aluminum. So when we think about warmth, we think about what can we do to fully digest everything that comes into our body. So we either take in less or we strengthen our body processes. That's really the only two ways that we work with that. So Paracelsus said the same thing in the 16th century. He said, all substances are poison. There is none which is not a poison, and the right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. This is exactly saying the same thing, right? Too much of something can be poisonous, even if it's healthy. And it's interesting because I've been saying that to my patients for a few years, and September 1st, this article came out saying exactly that. Mitochondria produce energy by burning down what remains of our meal after we have digested it. But it comes at the cost of constantly corroding themselves and us. You get oxidative damage when we don't bring things down to zero. They're talking about food, but I really think this is everything. Anything that comes into our body, we're going to need to digest. And they talk about how it's implicated, this residual undigested things are implicated in learning, memory, cognition, and every mental and neurologic affliction. And I love that they say exercise, meditation, sleep, sunshine, and eating habits. I just fell in love with this article. This is, validation for the last few years of what I've been doing. Okay, so this is a large source of where we've lost a lot of our heat over the past few generations. We hear all about problems with methylation, sulfation, all of these liver processes. This is where Tylenol has its effects, vaccines, antibiotics, anything that comes into the body is encapsulated into fat, and it goes into the liver. And when you have a fat-soluble toxin, it has to go from that through 2 stages of liver processing to become a water-soluble toxin. So through this phase and this phase, it takes a fat-soluble to a water-soluble so it can be eliminated. And the liver is really where we've had our biggest hit over the last 3 generations. Okay, so MTHFR, it was the golden child of 2015. Everybody was talking about it. The interesting thing I found about this is that they saw this one loci is thermolabile. I thought that was great. So that means not only is it the presence or absence of this epigenetic variant, but that it's thermolabile. So that means that we can possibly increase our function of this genetic variant with keeping ourselves warm. I mean, that's huge. There was a study in Canada that showed women that were pregnant and had fear because it was a really cold winter of not being able to get to their doctor to deliver their babies. They actually had epigenetic changes in their methylation that got passed on to their children. So, that's a big deal. And, again, we see this in anesthesia. We see that, when there's a methylation problem, there's a lack of warmth. We're not able to process the anesthetics that come in. There's been 2 cases of infant death from nitrous oxide from this very problem. There's an inhibition of something called methionine synthase that leads to accumulation of the anesthetic, of homocysteine and other processes in the body. And the interesting thing that I found, I don't have the source here, I'm sorry, but that vaccines inhibit this same enzyme by way of the aluminum adjuvant. And there's a lot of similarities between vaccines and anesthesia, but one thing that they don't have is, anesthesia doesn't have adjuvants, which is a big thing to consider.
Also, nitrous oxide uses a vitamin B12.
Yep, that's part of this whole methionine synthase process, for sure. And there was a group put together called Smart Tots in 2014. And I sat next to Ron Littman, who was the head pediatric anesthesiologist out of CHOP, and he was the guy that created this task force to look at the toxicity of anesthetics. So they're 3 years into this 5-year study, and they came out with a consensus statement that said, whoa, vaccines anesthesia may not be as safe as we think it is. We need to keep looking. We see long-term cognitive neurodevelopmental problems in children that receive anesthetics. And then that's why I bring it back to anesthetics are designed to be processed and cleared from the body quickly in 1 to 2 days. They don't have adjuvants. So, and it's the same pathways that vaccines have. So the science is not settled with our anesthesia colleagues, but it is settled with the vaccine colleagues. So it's just interesting. I think if we talked more in medicine, we might find some answers. So here's another example of a cooling process. They gave Tylenol to some kids in college, 82 kids. Half of them got Tylenol, half of them didn't. Then they gave them images of either, images that were happy or sad images. The kids that took the Tylenol had less of an emotional response, less happy and less sad to those pictures than the kids that didn't have the Tylenol. They repeated the study in adults and found the same results. And the lead investigator said, rather than just being a pain reliever, acetaminophen can be seen as an all-purpose emotion reliever. So, you know, a hugely cooling process on more than just the liver, but it also affects our heart. So there's a ton of data on acetaminophen in pregnancy and autism. So Tylenol cools the body, and then we see a lack of permeation of consciousness in the child. Okay? We see it here. We see it here. We see it here. You know, there's no paucity of data on this. We also see it with SSRIs, which are antidepressants. The same thing. The mother takes the SSRIs, and then there's issues with the development of the infant brain, of the child's brain. They actually see less cross-communication between the hemispheres when the mother takes SSRIs. So again, it's a cooling. You're fighting the body, cools the body, less consciousness comes in. So we're going to switch over to fever, which is, you know, my passion. We have seen throughout history the curative power of fever. We saw in 500, it always is ascribed to Hippocrates, but actually I found an earlier source of this, Parmenides in 500 said, give me the power to produce a fever and I'll cure any disease. We saw Hippocrates spoke of the beneficial effect of fever on epilepsy. Now, when I was describing that child who's waking up from anesthesia and the consciousness can't come in because the physical body is dense, that's the same thing that we're talking about with epilepsy. The seizure is the consciousness trying to come in and it can't. It can't fit in this way, so it tries this way, and it's just this oscillating, energetic effect. You know, that's what a seizure is. So if you can warm the body and soften those life processes, get flow in the body, you can actually get consciousness that comes in. We saw in 1917 there was a Nobel Prize awarded for this psychiatrist who used malaria fever to cure syphilis. So we're in a fever drought right now. We used to have these diseases of hot, acute illnesses, TB, the plague. That's what children would die of. Now, 100 years later, we have diseases of chronic neurologic disease. You know, so we've gone from one extreme to the other, and we kind of have to find this balance. Our children used to experience regular childhood fevers. So chickenpox, mumps, measles, rubella, roseola, they used to have these childhood fevers, and I call these a gut reset fever. This fever, this childhood illness, comes deep into the body, into the gut, clears what hasn't been previously digested. And then you see, teachers see this, the parents see this, the child makes a huge developmental leap. We know with roseola that happens about the time of crawling. We know chickenpox that happens about the time of crossing the midline. We know with measles that happens with reading. We have seen this historically. We're forgetting it, and I think we need to keep telling these. We need our elderly people to keep telling these stories, because without the stories, the history is going to get lost. So now we don't see these gut reset fevers anymore. What we see is kind of a simmering from October to May. These children are not really sick, but they're not really healthy. And this is half of our children. You know, they might have a chronic runny nose. They have a 99-degree fever. Mom, I don't feel good. And that is so frustrating to a parent to not be able to help their child because there's no real thing to work with. The child just doesn't feel good. And it's all school year long. So the parents are really struggling. So here we're looking at fever in ASD. And they found that when a child with ASD had a fever, they actually had improvement in some of their scores, some of their communication and language scores. And this was true. This was true whether the child was just a little bit sick or severely sick. So here's another example of a lack of warmth process. So we give, again, antipyretics in pregnancy, and then we see later on the child has wheezing and asthma. Again, we're cooling the body, and then we get residual undigested proteins in the lung. Okay? Here's an example from JAMA Pediatrics that looked at electronic toys versus real toys, books and blocks. And they compared these two groups, and the children that used these real toys, these real sensory toys, had better language. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If we are interacting with something that's real, we're touching wood or silk or wool. If we're touching that, our body doesn't have to say, what is this? Because it's something that exists in nature. It's something that naturally exists. When we touch something or interact with something that's synthetic, we have to use our warmth processes to warm that up to something that our body can understand. So if the child is using those warmth processes to understand what they're holding, they're not going to grow. So this is the study about food proteins and vaccines, but what I liked about it is they brought up the reminder of worms, of helminths. And I think this is, right now, this is a super hot topic in functional medicine. Clear all the parasites. The parasites are evil. They're causing problems with everything. But I throw out this question, why are they there? What's their function? If we look to nature, we see worms in the soil. What are they doing? They're turning the compost. They're a source of warmth for the soil to be able to propagate new life. So my question is there a certain level of parasites that's normal? We used to think that we didn't want any bacteria in our gut. We used to think that was healthy. And, boy, have we learned that that was wrong. So if it's there, we need to ask why it's there. I see so many kids with candida overgrowth. And they come in on just nystatin after nystatin in a super strict no-sugar diet. And there's an ongoing battle between mother and child because the child wants what their friends have and the mother says you can't. And it's just so many levels of problems that it's caused. And I ask, what is the candida doing there? What does fungus do in nature? Where does fungus grow? It grows in the forest on these logs where there's decaying material. What is it doing? It's turning over this decaying material. It's turning over the ecosystem to create new life. And we know from studies that candida and other certain bacteria act like trash trucks in our body to carry out things that have not previously been digested. So viruses, food, proteins, things like that. And we all know what a Herx reaction is. Most of us do. If you try to take something to kill all these candida and you get this horrible rash all over your body, it's not from the drug. It's from the candida dumping all their trash in your body, and you get an acute increase in toxins. Instead of the candida being allowed to carry it out of the body, we dump it. So I would offer, how can we support the body to carry the candida out? How can we optimize the body so the candida is no longer needed? Yep. And that really brings you back into your body. It brings your enzymes back to proper function. It brings your mitochondria back, and it makes you more comfortable. It calms your heart. We use warm blankets in anesthesia for the kids going to sleep and waking up. And we have the mom present. Those warm influences make a difference in how a child goes to sleep and wakes up. Yeah, sometimes we need just a little bit of dampening process so the body can function better. So sometimes there's a little bit of a killing process that's needed so that the body can face and rise up to the challenge. If we completely eliminate all the yeast, number one, it's a board, and the child can't learn. The child's gut can't learn how to handle yeast or problems why the yeast are there. So what I would say is in these instances where there's a huge overgrowth, maybe you do need a little bit to start with, but really you should be working on promoting life. So fermented foods, anything that's going to help promote the life in the body. Work on liver function, kidney function, regular rhythm. We're going to talk about some of this other stuff, but working on the underlying fundamental ways that we can warm the body. And then the yeast don't have a reason to be there. It's not a simple fix. Yeah, Sally? Yep. How they've been for 10,000 years. And there's a really good site called biodynamicwellness.com that teaches you how to prepare your grains and your beans and your nuts and all that. And I know Sally's site has an extensive information on food preparation. Have you looked into seeing a MAPS provider? A MAPS provider? MAPS, M-A-P-S. I would look into that type of provider. They might have something to offer.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so here we're giving a source of heat to be able to offset wheezing and asthma later. So we're giving fish oil, which oils are flammable, they're a source of heat, to kind of prevent lung problems later. Okay, I'm just going to flip through these. Same thing. We lower the acid, we get pneumonia. Okay, acid is a warmth process, digestion process. We lower the acid, we get pneumonia in people that are already losing their consciousness. We lower the acid, we get chronic kidney disease. We lower the histamine, we get gliomas, brain cancer. We give vitamin D, consciousness comes in. It improves autism. So I say the behavior of a child starts to change when they become cold. When your child suddenly starts to increase behaviors, check their hand temperature. Chances are it's cold. The best way to increase the hand temperature is to increase the core with layers. I'm going to skip over this out of time. Sorry about this slide. So how do we increase our warmth? Diverse biome, the right foods, healthy liver detox pathways, so working on our methylation, having clean mitochondria, having emotional warmth, eating food together, eating happy, eating at regular times. If we're eating at 7, 12, and 5 every day, at 6:45, at 11:45, and 4:45, we're already making enzymes to digest this food. Our body is already ready to take what's coming in versus a random snack that's grazing throughout the entire day. We never get down to the 0 point. The other thing is Dr. Jack Kruse does a lot of work with light and mitochondria. And what we're finding and what I've been using for the past few years is to have my patients go outside in the sunlight as their first source of light for the day. What that does is actually it sets your circadian rhythm, all your biorhythms for your entire day, which is manifested in your mitochondria, in your liver, in your adrenals, in your hypothalamus. So you're going to oscillate through the entire day with the set point as that long wavelength red-orange sunlight in the morning. Alternatively, if you pick up your cell phone or you turn on an overhead light, you're going to start here, and you're going to oscillate here for the entire day. And so for the entire day, you have to warm the process to get from this upper wave to the lower wave. All day, you're spending energy to get down to the normal biorhythm. So if we can just start the day with normal sunlight, it makes a huge difference. And then, of course, those good fats. When you're sick, we want to go on a sensory diet. So when we're sick, it's because we've had too much in and we don't have enough power to digest there's the two factors, either too much in or not enough forces to deal with what's come in. We're exposed to thousands, hundreds of thousands of viruses and bacteria every day. It's only when our process will become overwhelmed that we get sick. So starting from that point, if we can go on a sensory diet, so we lay down and rest, we take our proprioception out of it. We don't have to warm that process. We drink warm fluids. We don't have to warm cool stuff in our belly. Limit the proteins. They're energetically expensive, especially when we're sick. I would not limit proteins otherwise. I'm just saying when you're sick. Avoid TV, radio, Wi-Fi for that same reason. Probiotics, natural food sources if you can. If you can't, then supplements. Encourage bowel emptying. There's many different ways, but Epsom salts work really well. Allow flow if you can. Stay close to your child. We can not use these other interventions if we stay close, and then we know if our child's not doing well, then we interact. But, it's not just sending the child to school and saying, I'm not going to give them Tylenol, I'm going to let them fever it out. And remember, our kids are more physically dense than they used to be. Consciousness is harder to come into these children today. So when they have fevers, it can actually be more dangerous today than it has been in the past. And as a society, I am so glad to see that people are rejecting Tylenol and ibuprofen. And if we're not careful, we're going to have a backlash of severe childhood problems from fevers. We have to stay close. We have to find ways to move the fevers in, through, and out of the body. And some of these things will definitely help with that. Warm compress to the belly helps with that. And sometimes homeopathic and Chinese medicine is just the right thing to encourage flow when it gets stagnant. And stagnant flow causes things like meningitis, appendicitis, all those things that we don't want. So somebody I really look up to describes warmth as the enthusiasm for being. I think that is the perfect description. And I'm going to leave you with this idea. So we all know our medical, educational, financial, political systems are imploding, right? They're unsustainable and they're leading to their own self-destruction. And thank God, right? Because it's not working. In and among all of this destruction, we have this pile of rubble, right? It's the antibiotics that don't work. It's the systems that don't work. It's all of these things that haven't worked. And it's our collective broken heart. But that collective broken heart is the source of warmth that we can have to be like a phoenix going into the new way of being. You know, there are so many new things coming out. We heard about the nurse who refused to take blood from the unconscious patient despite being arrested. We have whistleblowers in all of our professions. 15 years ago, a doctor would never speak up. A cop would never speak up. A teacher would never speak up. And now, with Facebook and social media, people are coming forward, confessing the sins of their profession because the consciousness is changing. And so I just want to leave you guys with this hope. I see a lot of stuff behind the scenes that is good. And I want to leave you guys with this. We are creating what it is for the future. And I just want to leave you with that. So thank you so much for being here. Kelly? It's incredibly important. Thank you for that question. So when we wear synthetic clothing, it's the same thing. Our body, number one, has to figure out on a neurologic level, what is this substance touching me? It's not a normal frequency. There's been studies with linen that actually shows that. And when we're wearing natural fibers, our body doesn't have to digest our clothing, one. And number two, if we wear layers of clothing, it can allow the body to work on other, you can use the warmth for other growth and development, physical, mental, spiritual growth, instead of warming the body. And so several layers, like a silk layer is a nice base layer, and then, you know, wool is what I generally wear. When I speak, I wear this. It's just what I always wear. But in general, I'm always wearing natural fibers, especially for children. They should be covered from head to toe with a hat, even if it's a light layer. Bedding, we found that children that wear wool on their bed, wool toppers, they actually sleep later in the morning because they don't get cold. You know, so it's a really good question. Yep. And that goes across so many things. Kim John Payne talks about they don't feel the consciousness to make decisions. And he says 9 is the same age. So kind of this general warmth consciousness doesn't permeate the body till about age 9 or 10. And the parents really need to consider what is coming into that child's environment. And if that's not needed to digest, you know, keep it out. Keep the media out and the fear and all. If you can kind of keep that out, it's not crippling your child to do that. That's not a board. That's just common sense type things. They will get exposure to all of those things that we have in society when they have the emotional consciousness and the thinking consciousness to handle it. When they're still in their body trying to figure out what they need to do, anything that they need to process out of fear is going to set them back. I don't know that any tests, but I can tell you I've put over 10,000 children to sleep. I have the mother there. And I tell the mother before we go in the room, this is about your child. You know, mothers that are really anxious, this is about your child. And you are the biggest influence on what's going to happen as your child goes to sleep. They're going to be safe regardless. I'm going to take care of your child. They are going to be safe. But how they lose consciousness, their awareness of the experience is completely dependent on how you can meet the situation. So I tell the mother, stay close, get in close, sing their favorite song, talk to them. I don't allow any of the other personnel to talk to the child. It's only the mother and the child. I put a warm blanket on the child. And I can tell you, the PACU nurses, they describe the way my patients wake up, and it's different than the way other kids wake up. That's a whole, I have a pinned post on my Facebook page about that. It came out when the last child succumbed under anesthesia for that same thing. So it's called Why Are Children Dying Under Anesthesia? And a lot of it really is preventative. That's how you can decrease the risk of anesthesia, is to prevent the cavities. But then when you get there, really good ideas about what you're looking for in a facility, what questions you should ask. You know, it's a good topic, and it's huge. And this is also the lack of consciousness coming into the body, the fact that decay is coming up. There's issues with mouth breathing and food intolerance, and it's multifactorial. Yes, he talks about it, and he says this is an alternative to sunlight, but he still goes back to sunlight as the #1 gold standard. So he talks about cryotherapy and limited to stimulate certain wavelength frequencies that specifically stimulate the mitochondria to act. So I was just looking into that again yesterday, and he still stands by his thing that sunlight is the best, thing that we can do for that. Yeah.
So that's point number 1.
Right. Let me answer that one. So when we look at homeopathy, we see something that's paradoxical. It shouldn't work, but it does. So I would say that there is this dose-response relationship that is not linear with everything that we're doing. I think in regular medicine, we think cause and effect. But I think it's more detailed than that. And then also the size relates to the dose, because we know inhaling talc can give you lung cancer or ovarian cancer because of the size of the particle. So I think that there's a deeper question to that, for sure. So when we're talking about dose, the dose as pertains to how much reaches a certain part of the body, because you'll get a higher dose with a smaller particle in certain parts of the body. So, in the second part, how healthy is the mother? How healthy is the mother? And is the mother taking care of that fever, or is she taking Tylenol? Is she letting the fever go? What is the mother doing when she's fevering? Because my generation, right now, having kids, I'm actually a little bit beyond that, but someone in their 30s having kids, their body is physically dense. They're full of chemicals. If they get a fever and the fever doesn't penetrate all the way into their core like it's supposed to, and the mother is not facilitating that, yes, you will have problems with the baby, because this is the dysfunctional fever. Well, think about what happens with children that are given an MMR vaccine, get a super high fever, and then are given Tylenol. Now, a super high fever, I'm talking peripheral. Nobody's measuring the gut. Nobody is looking at how hot the gut is. But we can look at that secondarily. We know how hot the gut is, because an autopsy of these autistic children, where are the measles autoantibodies? In the cool parts of the body, in the gut, in the brain. So we know that the internal part of the body, despite what the outside is doing, the heat is not getting into the core. So, sometimes it takes looking at the bigger picture to kind of see something more clearly. Yeah, excellent. And this observation is such a key piece of medicine that we've lost. I trained with foreign medical grads. They told me I wasn't allowed to do a blood test, a scan, or anything on my patients. I had to diagnose them with my hands and my eyes. And I think that I'm thankful every day that they trained me this way, because it's this direct observation that's going to make the biggest difference. Yeah, I would wonder what else they're doing. They're probably eating a lot of fatty fish. There's probably other factors in their diet. They've got more cultural warmth. There's extended families together. There's so many other sources of warmth that we don't have here in the U.S. that, it's kind of an insult to injury after all of these other problems to underdress a child here. So it really is specifically to this culture. There's a movement in Germany to use biodynamic lighting in the OR, which is lighting that has the same frequency as the sun throughout. So it's kind of one of those ideas of how can we warm the OR. And surgeons always say that the room has to be so cold for infection control. And they found that that's actually false. There's more infections if the room is too cold. So, there's all of these ideas. I personally, when I have a patient on the operating room table, I do not allow my surgeon to lose it. If he's losing it, he leaves. I don't want that energy in my room. So I think it's just kind of, there's so many factors. And yes, interior design can be colors and things can be important. I think we have to go because we are over time, but I'm happy to talk to anybody outside. Thank you so much.